Jarrett, thanks for coming by.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jay.
No,
I'm really excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. We connected last night at not a bar. I'll say it was just a bar. Well, not just a bar. It was a great party. But talk a bit about, I'm going to pronounce it right, Arcadia, even though it's RKDA.
That's right.
Talk to me about sort of your background and Arcadia specifically.
Sure. Well, I've been in the industry for about 10 years. Prior to coming into the industry, I was a biologist. I did pharmaceutical research, and I got into the industry by writing an early application in New Mexico and winning a license and building up that company. And then my career just kind of grew. I wound up as the vice president of cultivation operations for Cresco Labs, and was with them for about 3 years and got to do a lot of exciting things there. And then I went on and I worked for several other companies. And for the past couple years, I've been an independent consultant, working in the kind of production operation space of cannabis, helping companies plan and build data systems and cultivation.
And they need that, of course. I want to go back to the first application you wrote as a biologist in New Mexico. Was it a bit like...
Just a reminder, everyone, that at 10:30 the programming sessions begin upstairs.
Sorry, if we talk to that
programming beginning at 10:30.
Sometimes it doesn't even catch it, but sometimes it does. We'll go back. So I want to go back to you're a biologist. You're in New Mexico. New licenses are being the application process is released. Were you just like, oh my God, this is going to be so fun to write an application, or were you like, this is going to be a whole new industry that's going to take me the next 20 years? Like, what was the thought process, if you can remember it?
Well, it was. As I look back on it, I feel like I was a little bit of a crazy person.
That's everybody's background on this. Yeah.
So I was working as a scientist. I was interested in what I was seeing happening across the country in cannabis, for a lot of reasons, because I personally love cannabis. As a scientist studying drugs, there's a hypocrisy in the fact that almost all of our FDA-approved drugs are based on natural products. They come from plants and fungus, and here's this plant with several hundred chemical constituents someone like me would be studying if it weren't illegal.
Right.
And I also believe too that it's a step towards ending the drug war, which is racist and criminalizes things like poverty, and it's just been so misguided and wasteful. So I was passionate, and I thought our state has to issue these licenses. And there was no strong reason for me to believe that. I just believed it.
Mm-hmm.
And I went up to Colorado. I met growers up there. At the time, Massachusetts made their applications public. And so I read, what I could from that.
It's really a deep dive.
Yeah, it was. And I met politicians and lobbyists, and I got land under contract, and then they announced there was going to be a license, and I had a lot of the work done, and so I wrote it up. I got one of these awards, and I think I was telling you last night, I felt like Charlie, and I opened this Wonka ticket, and there was gold. When I read this letter, I was trembling, and the work hadn't even begun.
Right. And now fast forward 10 years.
Yeah.
You've seen the industry evolve, certainly even on the cultivation side. Like our methodologies, the data, like the systems that people are setting up now for their operations, like are they 10 years more advanced, or is it like 100 years has gone by in how sort of things have evolved in the industry?
It's 10 years more. It's right where it is given all the constraints, right? Like I think a really big constraint on cultivation is not being able to centralize production. If it makes sense to have retail everywhere, but nobody wants to have, make bolts in every single state that they sell bolts in, right?
Right. Because it's very expensive. In Maryland, it's very expensive.
Yeah.
The land here is very expensive. New Jersey, it's even more expensive. New York, in some places, it's wildly expensive. And Massachusetts, like the states where it's very expensive, and also not necessarily weather conducive to doing it.
Absolutely.
Energy costs are through the roof in some of these places. Water is really challenging in some places.
Yeah.
So you gave a talk yesterday as part of NECANN. What were you talking about? Was this it? Was it like... I want to hear.
Yeah. So I guess where we have grown is that we're becoming more and more like manufacturing or agricultural industries, and so in standards and in scale, to the extent we're able to scale, we have matured. And so for me, I've seen a lot of kind of eras in cannabis, companies getting bigger and bigger in footprint, a real focus on acquisition, a real focus on sales. And now we're in this era of brands where you can really have a national brand and sell recreationally, and someone can go from Massachusetts to New York and buy the same products. And with brand, you are, in my view, you're creating some kind of niche for yourself, and you're going to create products around that. And being able to produce to a demand plan like a normal company becomes more and more important, and it's directly related to our profitability, because right now we live in an environment where growers, grow what they grow, and when production decides what gets made, not everything's getting sold anymore. Right. So that's kind of what I talked about yesterday. The title of the talk was Achieving Profitability Through Demand-Driven Production, and I just talked about the things that production operations have to do to prepare to be demand-driven.
So to make cannabis more like other industries.
Yeah. Exactly.
More profitable, longer standing industries that.
I read recently in MJ Biz that less than 25% of cannabis companies are profitable. And so, we've gone through this acquisition era. We've gone through this era where companies have become hyper-focused on things like sales, and now we got to bring down those operating costs. We can't have waste. We have to be efficient. And we have to find ways to reduce labor, reduce, energy costs, and all those things.
And thinking about the future, or thinking about 5 years from now, where maybe you could have production in places where it makes sense to have production as opposed to everywhere, and have retail everywhere because that's how you get products. But what does that look like from your perspective? Will it mean bigger footprints in states like Oregon for cultivation, or South Dakota, for example? Is that in your mind? Are you when you lie awake in bed, are you wouldn't it be amazing if there was this massive footprint of cultivation in X that then distributed around the country?
Yeah, great question.
It's a weird thing to think about, but is that what you think about?
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. I think with this rescheduling, a lot of people are focused on the changes to 280E, which is makes a lot of sense because it frees up a lot of cash. But the thing I think about is, are we going to be able to cross state lines? And when I think about in the U.S., I'm a big believer, maybe I'm biased because I'm from New Mexico and I live in Arizona, but the American Southwest, it's dry, especially if you're at elevation, you have good temps to grow in greenhouses, labor's cheaper than California, some areas there's access to good water. So I really think in the US, that's where we could see large scale operations, but I don't think it stays in the US. I really think, you see countries right now like Colombia that are selling to Europe, and they're growing to GMP standards, higher standards than many growers here. And Mexico is preparing for a national legal system, and I can't help but imagine that we're a big part of that market. And as I understand it, NAFTA is very powerful and may even be more powerful than interstate commerce.
Yeah, well, it's good for Canada too. Well, it might be good for Canada, it might be bad for Canada, right? Because in this grand scheme of things, Canada's probably more expensive to produce than in some places in the States, just labor costs alone, but also energy costs could be cheaper somewhere in Canada. It'll be this internationalization of production. Certainly will go where it makes the most sense.
Totally.
Which every other, for car manufacturing, chip manufacturing, everything.
If you're Coca-Cola, you're a brand that sources along the supply chain, and I see us moving much more in that direction as it becomes more and more federally legal.
It's the timeline that is the question.
Yeah, and that I just have no idea how to game out. I would have thought it would have happened. If you asked me 10 years ago, I would have thought it would have happened much sooner than this.
Yeah, and it's funny because you've been in it 10 years, but then you come to Maryland, and they're in the infancy of an industry.
Yeah, it's amazing to see here. It's like a total rewind.
Right.
Yeah.
It's amazing that everything, you could come to Maryland and it would have been like New Jersey 2 years ago, or California 12 years ago, whatever that is. But it is the cycle. Now, I think what is new and different, but I want to ask you, is that some of the mistakes that people make early days in older markets, hopefully they either won't make them or make them faster here.
Yeah, and there's better products and better equipment and processes and access to trained labor. So there's a lot more in place than the early days when you were like scrolling through YouTube and like
Right.
weird blogs.
Like how to set up a massive grow facility. Like I guess I'll have to call Jarrett. Like that's that. But it is a bit of like, you know, the either avoidance, mistake avoidance, or sort of building on the people that have come before you, both from a overall like regulatory perspective. Like the regulators in Maryland have been talking to folks around the country, what makes sense for Maryland, what doesn't, but also for operators to say like, okay, we've seen it in other states, let's try to avoid that. Let's not sign a 10-year lease when we only really know we're going to be in business for a year. Like that sort of really like nuts and bolts operational thing. But it is interesting to watch like a market in its infancy go from like infancy to like toddler, and then like toddler to like young adult, and then, or whatever. But it is an interesting thing to see again and again and again.
It really is.
Yeah,
it really is.
Yeah, but unique, I think, too, because I can't think of another industry that evolved like that with constraints that are state borders.
No, I mean, in some ways, it's like the real American dream. It's the true American experiment where every state's figuring it out, testing-wise and security-wise, distance from school-wise,
right.
and, you know, and so hopefully when federal legalization finally happens, we've tried all these things and they pick the best.
Yeah, but the other thing that is different, east versus west, is that out west, crossing state lines is not a daily activity usually, but here it certainly in DC, you know, they call it the DMV, right? District, Maryland, and Vermont.
Yeah.
Like, not Vermont, Virginia, but like that is people's daily lives, and so what Maryland does, you know, either too restrictive or too many taxes, or like people in DC will just stay in DC and buy weed.
Yeah.
And people in Virginia will go to DC as opposed to go to Maryland.
Yeah.
Like it really is the impacts of you're not making it's not an island anymore, right? Like what you're doing in your own state is not an island.
Yeah.
And so I think that is like three-dimensional chess, how you think about your regulatory environment, the market you want to set up.
Yeah.
Because people setting up border shops, like in Michigan, like once Ohio goes legal, like will Ohio people still go to Michigan to buy weed? We're about to find out.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I hear about that all the time. And I really think, too, it really puts brands to the test. Because, like, if you're a brand in one of these states and you let down the customer, you know, there's no reason for them to go to the next state and buy you. There's a lot of options right now. So it's really going to be interesting. I think out west, even though we had some states legal next to each other, we didn't see a lot of overlap between the same companies. We didn't see, you know, that
much more
brand
so
development. But right now, this is like the true brand test for these companies that are multi-state out
It's
here.
fun to watch.
Yeah, it is
really
fun to watch.
And we've seen U.S. brands come into Canada as well. Some
really?
Yeah, some really successfully, and some less so. And it's funny because we think of Canada as a shitty market, that it's not particularly, I mean, it's big, but not, it's big, but it's also geographically big. Yeah. You have to deal with provincial wholesalers, and the regulatory regime is strict. But some of those things actually lend itself to brands. Right? Like, okay, if we could find a brand partner that can help us produce what we want to produce in Canada, then we only have to sell to 9 people, 9 provinces, right, or whatever, or really one. Like, you sell into Ontario, that's a huge market to break into, and it's a pretty streamlined approach. You don't have to go door to door to retailers to like necessarily have them buy your brand. You just need to sell it to the province, basically. So it's like there's some. Like every market has its benefits and drawbacks, but it is interesting to watch each one develop and sort of how brands enter that space.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, I really it was nice meeting you.
Yeah, Jay,
and we'll
it was really nice
We'll
meeting
see you
you.
probably in a different state, different location, probably somewhere soon. But thanks for making time.
Yeah, thank
Thanks,
you.
Jay.
Have a great day.
You too.